Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to the lecture. So this week we're going to be talking about the first of two middle range societies, the Caribbean. So what do I mean by middle range societies? These are societies that have social inequality, they have complexity, but they're not full-fledged states. So specifically, I want to talk about the Caribbean for a couple of reasons. One is I think that islands are a great place to talk about the movement of people and the movement of things, or mobility and exchange. Uh, and that's for a simple reason. If you think about an island, uh, islands are discrete places surrounded by water. So if we find people or we find goods there, they must have either been produced there or come from somewhere else. And it's much simpler often to talk about movement and between islands than it is to talk about movement on continents or the mainland. And so that's one reason. The second reason, why the Caribbean in particular? So the Caribbean is neat for a few different reasons. The main one for me, though, is I've done Caribbean archaeology. I've worked in the Caribbean. So I got my master's at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands back in 2008 to 2009. And I did field work in the Dominican Republic, and I learned all about Caribbean archaeology. So I have a bit of a background in this as well. I also think it's a fascinating place. This was the first place that the Spaniards and Columbus arrived, and it was the first place to be colonized by Europeans as well. So it's got an interesting history, and that helps us understand it in some ways more than others. So I think a first question that we can think about is how do we study the movement of things and the movement of people in the past? How do we figure out if something has moved? And how do we figure out if people have moved over the landscape over time? Uh, and how do we figure out how people are moving things? So, are there large scale colonizations where people are bringing things with them and building things like they had before? Is it trade? These are all different things to think about. We'll get into them a little bit in this lecture, at least in some superficial ways. So, when we think about the movement of people and the movement of things, one of our chief ways of studying the movement of people and things is by looking at the movement of artifacts or their material culture over the landscape. For a long time, people equated the movement of artifacts with migrations of people. So there's a famous example from Germany of a society called the Linear Bang-Keramik culture. And people talk about ceramic or pottery types and cultures. And the idea essentially was as this pottery type spread out over time, people were spreading. But it's not really that simple. And how do we identify these types in the first place? We really use a concept of style to identify different types of pottery. So, style, what does that term mean to you? What is style? Style really is about the shape, the form, and the appearance of something. So how does something look? What shape does it have? What kind of decorations are on it? This is all part of style. So for a long time, people equated the movement of different styles of artifacts with, on a large scale, especially with the movement of people, and maybe the movement of these styles of artifacts on a small scale or an intermediate scale with trade. So maybe if a few things are moving back and forth, that's trade. But if there are a lot of things, especially multiple things from one area ending up in another, maybe that's an example. That's an example of a migration in the past. So one second. It seems like there's some kind of issue with this. Anyway, getting back to this, But there's some issues with this idea that style, the movement of things of a certain style, equals the movement of people, especially migrations. So one thing is there are different kinds of style, or there are different factors that go into style. So when we talk about the shape or the form of something, there's a lot of practical decision making for tools in particular. So, if we talk about cutting implements, the head of an axe is going to be thicker and have a different form than a knife or a arrowhead or something like that. An arrowhead has to have certain characteristics. That's a major reason why something may look how it looks, because that's the best possible form for accomplishing that task. Or a fish hook may have a hook shape because that's the best possible form. Now, when we talk about use and form, we can easily have multiple people who have nothing to do with one another inventing a similar tool for similar purposes. So a famous example of this actually goes back to what we were talking about a few weeks ago with the peopling of Americas. There were archaeologists for a while that claimed that uh, the Americas were peopled from Europe because there were similar looking projectile points, so spearheads and such, in Europe as in the Americas. It's something called the Solutrean. Now, this has been roundly criticized and rejected, and it's suggested using other evidence as well that people are coming from Asia, not from Europe. But this is a case of mistakenly equating similar looking tools with with similar functions as coming from the same place. But we can look at other aspects of an item that are less closely associated with its practical use as maybe a stronger indicator of style. There are multiple ways of thinking about these items. So one big thing for style that might be less practical, but an important marker of identity is decoration. So when we talk about pottery, pottery can be painted, it can be etched with and incised with implements. It can be fired in different ways and have different mineral inclusions that make it look different. Those are purposeful decisions and visible decisions on the part of its producers that have less to do with its practical use. And of course, when we talk about pottery, the form is probably the biggest part that determines its practical use. So different types of pots are going to be used for different things. But there may be decorations that are regionally unique. There also may be other ways that they're constructed that might not be even visible that could have been done one of multiple ways and are just done the same way over and over again by tradition that may lock into style and such. Point being that the use of style to track the movement of goods is complicated. It brings up problems. And another issue is when we talk about decoration, sometimes there are artifacts that are copied or emulated by neighboring peoples or by other peoples because they like the design, because they like the how something looks, they like the people that created it. And are those how we interpret emulation, or how we interpret that, is very different than the large scale movement of people in a migration, or the large scale or a trade from one point to another. Now, luckily, there are some technical ways to figure out if something actually moved, and we'll get to that in just a second. But the point is that these factors of style and emulation and such complicate our understandings of what's going on. So just because there's a bunch of pottery that we find all of a sudden somewhere else doesn't mean that people moved from there to there, or it doesn't even mean that there's a large scale trade going on, maybe copied or something like that. Now, the solution archaeologically to figuring out when people and when goods actually moved comes from chemical sourcing. So what we can do with artifacts is we can look at the elemental composition of artifacts using a number of different analyses, and we can compare that composition between regions. So we can compare artifacts between regions to see if they were made at the same source. And we can also look at the source material. So for stone artifacts, we can do compositional analysis on certain types of stone. Some work better than others. So obsidian or volcanic glass is one that works very well. And we can figure out, looking at this at sources of that stone, so natural deposits, what is the elemental composition of that source, and then we can analyze artifacts. Did it come from that source? Did it come from somewhere else? We can do the same thing with deposits of clay and pottery to try to figure out where that pottery is coming from. So we can compare the raw material that may have been used to build or to create an artifact to the material that we find in the artifact itself and look for chemical similarities. And you do that usually with a multifactorial analysis that takes into account multiple different elemental building blocks. And some will be more important or vary more than others, so usually they're limited to a few. There are a couple major ways of analyzing artifacts this way. I'll mention two of them briefly. One of them is called instrumental neutron activation analysis. And this literally uses a nuclear reactor, and it vaporizes a sample of a artifact and uses sensors to measure how much energy is given off and such in order to identify the elemental composition of the item. So what different elements was it made out of, in what proportions? It's one of the most precise ways that we can source anything, but it's both destructive and it's expensive. So you have to vaporize a sample. And usually what people do with things like pottery is they take a little tiny piece of a pot, they drill out a tiny piece, and they do the analysis on that. They're not taking a whole vessel. They're not taking even a whole piece of a vessel. And it's also expensive. There's only so many nuclear reactors in the world, and there's only so much time that they can devote to any given study. So it takes time and money for you to actually get your artifacts to there. A cheaper way of analyzing artifacts is something called X-ray fluorescence. And this essentially uses X-rays to disturb the electrons in an item. You can do it either in a machine, or you can nowadays do it with a scanner. So it looks like a pistol. That's what you're seeing right there. It disturbs the electrons. A certain amount of energy is given off based on the number of electrons for each thing, and it can pretty much figure out what elements are part of that artifact. So it is cheaper than an instrumental neutron activation. It's non-destructive in the case of these pistols. So people are using these for all kinds of things. They're using them for geology. They're using them for chemistry. They're using them for like oil, for mining, all these different applications. But we use them for archaeology as well. And it works really well for stone tools, for obsidian in particular, less well for other things. It's a little less precise than INAA, but it's a lot cheaper and it's non-destructive. And so this is something that is being more and more used for certain types of studies. And using those principles I just mentioned, we can figure out, where something made and how far it's traveled from that source, which is really interesting and really useful for thinking about how trade works and such. Now, we're also interested in the movement of people. As I said early on, people would talk about the spread of these pottery types and talk about cultures and the migration of people and such. The movement of artifacts does not mean that people moved. There are different types of trade that don't require long distance movement of people. And trade may occur on very small scales where people are going back and forth. Doesn't mean there's large scale migrations. There are also ways of sourcing people. There are chemical ways of figuring out where people were born and comparing that to where they die, which are kind of interesting. there's a few different isotopes that can be used. Strontium and oxygen. I'll mention strontium because it's one of the most common. Essentially, strontium is a element that we find in local geology throughout the Earth in varying quantities and amounts. And it's an element that leaches into drinking water. So you can make a map of any given area, and you'll find differences in the amount of strontium. So that's a strontium map of the US. And what's interesting is we absorb and we use strontium in the building of our bones. So you can analyze your bones and you can see different amounts of strontium. Now, in particular, teeth are very useful for studying ancient migrations. Why is that? That's because teeth are the only bones in our body that form when we're adolescents and stay inert or stay the same for the rest of our lives. Our teeth do not grow and regrow. They don't regenerate themselves. You have two pairs of teeth. One are your baby teeth, the other one are your adolescent's teeth, and that's it. As you all know, hopefully you got to take care of what you have, or you're going to be paying a lot of money at the dentist. But that works really well for studies of mobility, because we can look at ancient teeth and do strontium analyses of teeth and figure out if where people lived when they were adolescents is the same as where they lived when they died. So we can compare the local signature with the signature in their teeth. And then we can find a similar signature on the map to try to figure out where somebody's from if they're non-local. So these kinds of studies have really revolutionized our understanding of movement. And it's actually highlighted that there's a lot more movement going on within communities in the past than we thought. So just thinking about the ancient Maya, that's one of my core competencies. A lot of people are saying now that 15 or 20% of populations are non-local or were born somewhere else in most major Maya cities. That's something that people would not have argued previously. So, and again, just repeating what I said in the intro. So why are islands so good for studying mobility and exchange, the movement of goods and the movement of people? Islands are these discrete places. There's limits to the island. And they're small systems. They may not have all of the varied resources of a mainland. And because of that, it makes it easier. And they're also spaces that weren't inhabited by people until more recently. So it makes it easier to track the movement of non-local goods. So there's a certain type of stone you find on an island, then there are no sources there, it's from somewhere else. And it also makes it easier to conceptualize and think about the movement of people in some ways, because we know that they had to be coming from somewhere else. So, and as I mentioned in the intro, I also wanted to give this lecture partially because I have a background in Caribbean archaeology. And I did field work. I did my master's degree in the Dominican Republic with Taino and the use of landscapes in Eastern Dominican Republic near Punta Cana. Some of you may have been to Punta Cana if you've been to the Dominican Republic. And you can see a younger, probably more handsome version of myself in these pictures than the current version you're seeing now. But it was a lot of fun. We went and did a lot of swimming in underground pools. Those were the only sources of water people had. So we found a lot of pottery and such. And a lot of my thinking with that project was considering how people used the ancient landscape, making art and using these pools and moving around and such. So when we talk about the Caribbean, it's an island chain. It's really made up of two major parts. There's the larger islands, which are kind of more continental. They're on a plate, I believe. These are called the Greater Antilles. So we're talking about Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, which is the Dominican Republic and Haiti, Cuba and Jamaica. They have a much more varied geographies with all of them are somewhat mountainous with flat areas and beaches and such. There's a lot of different sources of materials and such as well. Cuba is the largest, though Hispaniola is also pretty large. And then further to the east and the south, we have the Lesser Antilles. So the Lesser Antilles are a chain of islands that are a lot smaller. They're going from the Virgin Islands to Trinidad and Tobago. They're also really diverse. So there are different kinds of islands in the Lesser Antilles. I guess it's where a couple plates meet. And so we have a number of volcanic islands in the Lesser Antilles. These are places like Guadeloupe, for example, or Ceiba. That's actually a picture of Ceiba. And there are also a number of coral islands in the Lesser Antilles. So coral islands are essentially buildups of ancient coral reefs. There are these lower lying islands. They're often bays and such. The point being is we have a mix of volcanic islands with volcanic resources and coral islands in the Lesser Antilles. I think Trinidad and Tobago is its own kind of thing related to the mainland. Now, how do we conceive of the ancient Caribbean in popular culture? I think that there are a number of memes that began with the Spanish, or ideas that began with the Spanish, that come to us today even, that are kind of interesting. One of them is thinking of Caribbean island peoples as cannibals, as kind of tribal and as cannibals. And you see that communicated in Pirates of the Caribbean, for example. There are parts where they're on an island with the cannibals and they're going to eat them and all of that. You know, that's kind of echoed in multiple different ways. It's played with even in science fiction. So if you think about Star Wars and the Ewoks, there's an element of islander cannibalism in there. But this image of Caribbean islanders as cannibals, the Caribs as cannibals, is one. Personally, from my own childhood, this is earlier than a lot of your time, but another sort of weird source of Caribbean imagery. They're Legos. I think there are later Pirates of the Caribbean Legos too, so that might be more from your time. But there was a whole series of Lego sets that were islanders, and they kind of combined the Caribbean with the Pacific. It's not that accurate, but you had people with these kind of more cannibal people with masks and with skull cults and all kinds of stuff like that, like what you see in the Pirates of the Caribbean. So we have this slightly negative view, I think, of Caribbean islanders in popular culture. But the Caribbean is fascinating, as I said. They're the first peoples encountered by the Spanish. So Christopher Columbus in 1492, if you remember, he sailed the ocean blue, but the first place Columbus landed was in the Bahamas, and he dealt with Lucayan Taino peoples in the Bahamas. You can read his descriptions. And the first places colonized were in Hispaniola and Cuba and such by the Spaniards. That's where they were building their first haciendas, and that's where they were mass murdering their first indigenous people as well. So there's a unique view of history from the earliest descriptions of the Caribbean. The Spaniards were they're large scale descriptions of the Caribbean in these works. Now, because of this early contact, there's also a lot of linguistic influence from the Caribbean on modern European languages. So these are just a few words, but terms like barbecue, caiman, hurricane, hammock, iguana, maize, savannah, these are all terms that are actually from Taino, which is one of the major Arawakan Caribbean languages. And just to drive the point home, I love this image. It's from an early Spanish chronicler, and he's showing the first hammocks that they encountered. So Europeans didn't know about hammocks before they went to the Caribbean and saw indigenous people using hammocks, and they started to use them themselves. So, talking about the chronology briefly, we really see the earliest settlement of the Caribbean 4000 to 2000 BC. It's really, I'll talk about it in a second, but there's a period of kind of stabilization and growth where pre-ceramic hunter-gatherers are living there. There's a migration of South American farmers from 5000 BC to 1000 BC, where they're bringing the first or some of the earlier pottery into the region, and they're really having a fluorescence or having a high period up until 600 AD or so. And then there's a rise of chiefdoms and the development of the Taino and Carib cultures, maybe from 600 to 1500 AD. We don't really know much about the pre-ceramic people. We've found a few burials and some grinding stones and some points. So these are some points that were used, some projectile points used for hunting. But the sites are pretty dispersed and pretty difficult to find. And there's arguments even about where these people were coming from, with some people suggesting they were coming from Mesoamerica, so from Mexico or Central America, and other people suggesting they were coming from South America, so from Venezuela and Colombia and such. But we know relatively little about them because they left relatively little on the landscape. We do know that they helped to spur some extinctions of some larger animals and plants and such, and change the environments they came into contact with. Again, around 500 BC to 250 BC, we see a migration of ceramic making farmers from Venezuela. I'm going to talk about this in some more detail. It's kind of interesting how they moved and what they took with them. And there are other groups as well that seem to come there. So there's a migration with other South American artifacts called the Huecoid. These different groups, this group is called the Saladoid. It's based on the pottery type, and it's a pots equals people sort of thing, kind of. But and then finally, we see these complex chiefly societies develop. The Taino specifically are one of them. And there's more inequality. There's some permanent architecture and some interesting fancy artifacts and such. And we'll talk about who they were and such. I think an interesting thing to talk about in some more detail, because it tells us about settlement and the movement and people and such, is the settlement of the islands by ceramic making farmers. So this Saladoid settlement that happened from 500 BC until 0 BC. Now, these people, they come from the Amazon. These farmers came from the Amazon, and this pottery type, the Saladoid, is actually named after a site called El Saladero in modern-day Venezuela on the Orinoco River. These were riverine people who were part of a larger Arawakan language group. This is one of the largest indigenous language groups. If you look at the map, that's really concentrated around rivers. You see it throughout the Amazon basin, going all the way up into the Caribbean. And it's a culture. There's culture that goes along with the language group. It's associated with manioc or cassava agriculture. So the picture I'm showing right here are cassava roots. I don't know how many of you have tried cassava roots or haven't. In Latin culture, you see it. One of my favorite preparations is yuca frita, or fried cassava. You peel it and you fry it. These were settlements that were built throughout the Arawak region in the past, and in more historical times, they're built around circular plazas. They tend to have more inequality, so there are chiefs and commoners, and they were people that moved on rivers and also moved across the ocean. Beyond cassava, which is the principal staple, they also had corn, sweet potatoes, arrowroot as another major tuber. And there were specific agricultural techniques like building mounds for the cassava that we see evidence of in the Caribbean. We see evidence of in the Amazon as well. So these farmers that colonized the Caribbean, they seem to have done it very quickly. And so we actually see the earliest evidence of people using these pottery types in Trinidad and Tobago and in Puerto Rico. So it seems like they skipped over a lot of the smaller, lesser Antilles, and they actually come back later and fill in again. So they were looking for bigger, nicer islands. They don't seem to have really made it further than Western Puerto Rico. There seems to be a boundary between these people and the aceramic people that were present in earlier. But this isn't a case of this an incremental stepping stone style of migration. It seems like they moved quickly to the biggest islands. This was probably significantly helped because throughout most of the Lesser Antilles, the islands are visible from one another. So you can see where to go next and you can keep going to and explore. So it seems like there was a lot of rapid exploration to get to Puerto Rico, which is one of the bigger islands, and Trinidad and Tobago and Puerto Rico are inhabited first, with these smaller islands filled in later. And these early sites, we see that they're clearly Arawakan peoples. They're using the same pottery decoration styles as you see at El Saladero in Venezuela. They're building a couple of the sites we've studied a little better. We can see they're built around a circular plaza that has houses around them. And we also see new tools and implements like griddles that are used for baking cassava bread. Also, probably they could have been used for corn and other things. So there's a whole series of new ways of doing things that go along with the movement of people into the Lesser Antilles and Puerto Rico and such. These Saladoid people, we don't really see much evidence of them in Hispaniola. There's some later Saladoid stuff on the eastern tip of Hispaniola. I actually found some Saladoid artifacts in my own work, but most of the Dominican Republic, it seems like early ceramic groups maintained their identities, and they even made some of their own types of pottery. I didn't find any pictures of that. That's not very prominently, it's published about, but there's not pictures, and it's not really prominently demonstrated. But there's a lot of talk. How did these aceramic or non-ceramic people that have been living there for a long time and these new South American groups interact with one another? Some people suggested previously that maybe the South Americans replaced the aceramic peoples, but it may be a case of just lots of these farmers moving in and combining and blending and integrating non-ceramic peoples into their communities. And again, it seems like there's more than one migration of people from South America coming in. It's not just these Arawakans. Another mysterious group that we find evidence of in Puerto Rico and Vieques. So Vieques is the island next to Puerto Rico specifically. Their pottery is called Huecoid. I forget what the site's called, but it's based on the type site. And what's fascinating is we find greenstone pendants of South American condors at these sites. There are no condors like this in Puerto Rico or anywhere else in the Caribbean. So they were moving items and ideologies and such from South America to these Caribbean islands. But the point is, there are all these different interacting populations. There's the earlier aceramic people, there's these Saladoid, Arawakan people, and there are other people like the Huecoid. And there's even a later migration around 800 AD of Carib speakers. So Carib is another major South American language, and that we'll talk about the dichotomy between Carib and Taino at the end of the lecture. Now, what's fascinating with all this is there's evidence, there are a number of different types of things we can look at to understand exchange, both on sort of an inter-island level and on a regional level beyond the Caribbean even. And that's what's kind of fascinating with the Caribbean. There are things that are coming from South America and Central America into the Caribbean. One of the better markers of regional trade actually is flint. We see this from the aceramic until later. There's one great flint site source on Antigua. It's an island called Long Island right off of Antigua. We find Long Island flint all over the Caribbean, and we can see the quantities and when things show up and such, and kind of understand chains of interaction. There are also some types of shell and such that we don't find everywhere, and volcanic stone we don't find everywhere. We can use those to track inter-island movement. What's really fascinating, though, is there are a decent number of artifacts that seem to be coming from outside of the Caribbean into Caribbean. And the how and the why are things that people are still debating. But one of those is jade. So there is only one known source of jade in all of the Americas, and that's in Guatemala. Yet somehow jade artifacts were being produced and were being brought into the Caribbean and were being shaped into shapes that made sense for Caribbean people. So these double frogs or something typical in the Caribbean. You see them also in Costa Rica and South America as well to a degree. So we know people were coming, were moving these green stones into the Caribbean from outside. There's no known source of greenstone in the Caribbean. There are not many in South America even. There's some thought that there's some element of down the line trade where it's not like Maya people were making it to Puerto Rico, for example, but items were traded from one group to another, and then that group might have gone into the Caribbean. Another fascinating item that was very important to Caribbean people that's kind of similar is a metal alloy called guanine. So guanine is a mix of gold and copper, and it's something that was there's no evidence that either gold or copper were mined in the Caribbean or were produced really. Rather, these were things that were made in Colombia. So there's a group called the Tairona. They are famous for metalworking, and it's believed that these metal artifacts were moving from Colombia into the Lesser and the Greater Antilles. So we can see that there's a lot of things moving around, and I think some of the movement of these exotic goods in particular are really fascinating. There's also specific shells from the Pacific that we find in small quantities in the Caribbean. And this tells a story of greater interaction than once thought. Now, I've also learned about the cultures of Costa Rica in particular, just because I'm interested. And it strikes me there's a lot of overlap in beliefs and ideas as well. So ideas and beliefs and such are moving around from South America into the Caribbean, into Costa Rica and such. And so we see things like a rubber ball game. We see specific iconographies and such, and specific ideas, the use of hallucinogenic drugs. These are all things that have Amazonian origins and move throughout into other parts of the Americas, including the Caribbean. Now, we can look at the movement of people as well. There was a lot of excitement around this for a long time in the Caribbean in particular. I actually was part of a research group with a guy getting his PhD that was doing some of this work. Unfortunately, the studies haven't been as conclusive as they hoped. And if you look at the map of strontium in particular, I think part of it is, that's the upper one, because the islands are more similar than to one another in other parts than one might hope for strontium. But there are some interesting results that he had found. He's done work in Ceiba, he's done work in Cuba and elsewhere, and he's found that, for example, the site El Chorro de Maita in Cuba, over 20%, he believes over 20% of the population was non-local. They were born somewhere else, and they made it to Cuba from somewhere else. So I think that as more studies are done, and it seems like he's now doing multi-elemental studies, looking beyond strontium to things like oxygen, we're going to get better evidence of a human mobility than what is presently known. So a final thing that's just kind of neat that I like to describe a little bit are classic Taino and Carib culture. So this is kind of the last part of this. When we talk about the Taino, they're known for their unequal societies as chiefdoms. That's what the Spanish encountered. That's what the chroniclers write about. They write about multiple different chiefdoms with specific caciques or chiefs. there are reconstructions of some of these in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Hispaniola. Right here, you see a map of Hispaniola with the different chiefdoms like Higüey and Jaragua and such. And a physical manifestation of power or chieftaincy in the Caribbean and also in South America and Costa Rica are these chairs or stools called dujos. So chiefs would sit on these stools that would elevate them. They're kind of like thrones even. This is one of the famous wooden ones that was found in the Dominican Republic. Additionally, these chiefs, they created larger centers that were capitals for their chiefdoms. And these centers, they are known for their plazas, their formalized plazas, sometimes their pathways and entrances to the plazas. And they're also known for these ball courts. So some of the most well-studied and famous ball courts in the Caribbean are actually in Puerto Rico. There are a couple of ones that people talk about a lot. Tibes and Caguana. Caguana is shown here. You may have heard of the Mesoamerican ball game that was played in there's a specific type of field essentially for the Mesoamerican ball game. There are two wedge-shaped structures that are around the field, and you bounce the ball off of it. That the Caribbean and the Amazonian ball game was different. These were round spaces that the ball was bounced around within. And what's cool at Caguana in particular is these round spaces were decorated with rock art, with petroglyphs. And so you see different images of gods and such at Caguana. So all of those stones have incisions, petroglyphs on them. Now, a big part of the religion of Taino peoples centered around shamanism and the use of hallucinogens to convene with the gods. And so we find all kinds of drug paraphernalia. So the specific drug they use is something called cahoba. It's a plant. It was mixed with tobacco to make a snuff. We find what are referred to as snuff tubes, where you would inhale the snuff. The use of this snuff made you feel sick, and so they have these artifacts called vomiting spatulas that you'd literally put down your throat. It would make you vomit. And they created these artifacts that were associated with the gods they adored called semis. There's a common style of those called that are called three-pointers. They also make masks and such. But anyway, the use of hallucinogens was a big part of Caribbean religion. It was a big part of Taino religion. And we see some of this with the Lesser Antilles as well. So these were unequal, small-scale societies that were growing manioc, maize, sweet potatoes. They lived in centers where they were playing ball games. And they conducted these religious practices using hallucinogens. Typically in European accounts, the Taino are contrasted. They're often shown as peaceful, and they're contrasted with the warlike Caribs. So the Caribs were the peoples that occupied much of the Lesser Antilles, and they were rumored by the Spaniards to be cannibals. And there's a lot of debate about whether cannibalism actually occurred among the Caribs. But they're often contrasted, the violent Caribs and the peaceful Taino. Now, a lot of more recent linguistic studies and studies of the Caribs in particular suggest that they were more similar to the Taino than we might think. There seems to have been a migration of peoples speaking Carib languages, but it seems like they mixed with people speaking Arawakan languages. And so you see in Carib dictionaries, you see things that come from Arawakan origins as well as things that come from Carib origins. We also see artifacts and styles and things from the Greater Antilles that are imported and used in the Lesser Antilles. So the point is the differences are less than we think, and there seems to be a bit of a smear campaign or some politics on part of the Europeans in order to make the Lesser Antillians look to be savages and maybe justify taking over their islands and killing them and such. And a final thing, of course, to say about the Caribbean is these islands were the first places to be decimated by European colonization. They were the first places to be conquered. And within 10, 15 years, even of the conquest, their populations were dwindling to nothing. And Europeans early on even would make raids on Central America and the South American coast and bring people back to their plantations in Hispaniola and Cuba and such because there were no people left. And there's some really fascinating documentation and things even about suicides and how quickly and how horribly populations ended. Now, when their DNA studies of modern Caribbean people suggest that there was intermarrying and mixing, and Caribbean DNA survives, and even some Arawakan Caribbean culture survives. There's a fascinating group called the Garifuna that they were originally on St. Vincent, and they were the result of shipwrecked slaves who intermarried with local Arawakan communities and had offspring, and were eventually deported to the coast of Central America. And they still speak an Arawak language. So there are some traces of Caribbean populations, but they're not widespread today. So that is the end of that for this lecture.